All right, so this week's guest is Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He is a retired Army colonel and a former senior Pentagon advisor, and we're going to speak to him about the latest in the proxy war in Ukraine. Colonel Doug Macgregor, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So the dominant media narrative we're getting right now is that Russia is on its back heels. It's been pushed back in a series of Ukrainian counteroffensives, and there are more to come from Ukraine. And Putin is desperate. That's why he is calling up these hundreds of thousands of reservists. From your vantage point, how do you assess things right now?
Well, like most of you, I'm trying to keep up with current events as best as I can. That's not an easy task these days. But what we've seen now for the last 2 months in southern Ukraine on the Russian side is effectively what I would call an economy of force mission. Most of the regular army, in fact, all the regular army combat troops, and there were never more than 80,000 of them in Ukraine to begin with, have been largely withdrawn. And they have been replaced by a little over 50,000 troops who are very good fighters, by the way, but we would call them either volunteers or mercenaries or National Guard types, reserve formations, principally the Chechens commanded by Kadyrov. And you have some Kuban Cossack organizations. You have the Wagner mercenary groups, if you will. The Wagner fighters and the Chechens are absolutely first rate. Their mission is very simple. We're putting you on the periphery in a defense of southern Ukraine, the areas that we now occupy as Russians, that we've now annexed. We want you to defend them, but you're under no obligation to defend to the last man or to defend every inch of terrain. You are free to withdraw whenever necessary in order to find more defensible terrain, because your real mission is to drag in as many Ukrainian forces as you can and destroy them, principally with artillery, air power, and long-range strike weapons. And that's what's been going on. And the kill ratio has been, up until now, for every one Russian soldier or Russian volunteer, Chechen, whatever, in southern Ukraine that's wounded or killed, and there are very few being killed, 5 to 6 Ukrainians are killed or wounded. And that ratio seems to be improving in favor of the Russian side every day. But what we have is an attempt by the Ukrainians. They're throwing virtually everything they have, including the kitchen sink, into this. Almost 300,000 people, of whom maybe 30,000 are really very well trained. And they're concentrating 40 or 50,000 whenever they can in a relatively narrow zone against perhaps 3, 4, 5,000 Russian troops. And in some cases, they're succeeding in pushing them back. But in the process, they're losing 40 to 50% of the attacking force, and they can't replace the equipment. And what happens is that they move perhaps 20 miles, 15 miles to more defensible terrain. And we got to understand, in this part of the world, everything's very open and rolling. So if you can fall back to a slightly higher elevation with an open field of fire, in other words, you're not looking at forest or looking at a village or a town, you have the ability to destroy large numbers of attacking Ukrainian forces in relatively short order. And that's really what's happening. So these great claims of, we're raising the flag in whatever it is, we've gotten it all back, we're heroes and we're winning. That looks good on television. It's a great propaganda ploy, but in reality, it's not gaining anything strategically, and it's playing into the Russian hands.
Why is there such a difference between what is happening on the ground and the way the media is covering it?
Well, as I mentioned earlier today, someone pointed out to me, and then I subsequently listened to it on Fox. I think it was Lieutenant General retired Kellogg, who is part of former President Trump's inner circle, was telling everyone on Fox that the Russians were running out of tanks. Now they have to fall back on T-62s. Well, this morning, long columns of brand new T-80 tanks from the Russian army were seen moving into the northeastern section of Ukraine, crossing bridges, moving in very rapidly. And we've already seen T-80s begin to show up down in southern Ukraine. So I don't know what the source of information is. Leon Panetta was on saying similar things. And then, of course, there's always the claim Putin can't survive this. Putin's back is against the wall. He's not going to be with us much longer. Of course, they also said that about Assad in Syria, and we've heard that about the leadership in Tehran. But in this case, it's particularly absurd because from inside Russia, the picture is very, very different. He's not only popular, and he really is popular in the high 80s right now, he's probably been stronger than ever. The only anger directed at President Putin is the feeling among Russians that he's taken too long to attack decisively. They haven't understood his rationale for the way things have been going for the last several months. And their attitude is, sure, this is a brother Slavic country. We understand that. But these people deserve the worst. Look what they've done to us, and so forth and so on. So the population is actually far more aggressive, if you will, in its attitudes and readiness to fight than, frankly, the president has been. But I think that is changing now, because this economy of force mission will probably continue until the ground freezes. And the forces being assembled in Belarusia and in Western Russia are enormous. And they include a lot of armaments that we haven't seen before, vast numbers of Iskander missile launchers and Iskander missiles. And that when that lands and it has a precision guided warhead of over 1,000 pounds TNT equivalent, it registers on the Richter scale. So these things are being masked. The Air Force is being masked. And he recently this morning gave instructions, according to British intelligence, that they were to disable or destroy satellites over Ukraine. He wouldn't tolerate any more satellites working for the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, hopefully, that doesn't include American satellites, but it's not a secret that if they're up there and they are immediately over Ukraine inside the Ukrainian battle space, they could be shot down.
You mentioned people inside Russia, in the establishment being frustrated at Russia's war strategy so far as not being aggressive enough. And there was an article recently in the New York Times which said that Western officials are baffled at how Putin has not escalated the war so far. So what is your understanding of what Russia's strategy has been so far? And how does that hold up with how you expected Russia to wage this war?
Well, answer to the first question is, Aaron, I'm not on distribution from the Russian General Staff, the Stavka in Moscow. So I have to try and glean from lots of people that are on the ground over there in Europe, as well as some analysts here and in Great Britain, but mostly in Europe and Germany and elsewhere. And what emerges from this is the following kind of picture. I think it's very clear that when President Putin began this campaign, he fully expected that when he demonstrated that he was serious about eliminating the threat to Russia in eastern Ukraine, something which he had been talking about for a long time. This was over the last 8 years, was made very clear. He also expected that he would have a negotiating partner. He thought that not only would the Ukrainians want to negotiate, but he thought, I think, that Washington would be interested in negotiating an end to the fighting and the conflict. I don't think he appreciated the level of ideological commitment and hatred in support of a war with Russia, and our willingness to turn this proxy war into our war in all but name, using Ukrainian lives instead of American and NATO lives per se. So it took him a while to come to terms with that, and I think he eventually did, especially when Mr. Biden went over in April and made his speech about regime change and talked about other things. I think at that point they figured this is a waste of time. These people aren't interested in negotiating an end to the conflict. At that point, they took stock and they said, okay, we're going to strike back, but we're not going to strike back in piecemeal fashion. We're not going to launch a series of offensives to drive back the Ukrainians. What we're going to do is take what we had originally thought was Russian anyway, which of course is, the people that live there are Russians in those areas. Then we are going to build up for a major offensive. If they will not cooperate, if they will not recognize the legitimacy of our position, then we will launch it and we will terminate this conflict on our terms. Well, you got to keep in mind that this is a theater that's almost 800 miles deep and certainly 500-600 miles wide. It's a vast area. that requires a lot of time to position forces, move forces. This applies to Ukrainians. It applies to the Russians. And now I think what we are on the verge of seeing is this major offensive. He may actually approach the Ukrainians one more time. And then if he has no success and no one will talk, I think he's going to unloose hell, frankly. And we're going to see a very different Russian military establishment doing things that, frankly, people like me and others thought they would do much earlier. But again, the man did not want to kill civilians, contrary to what is said in the West. He didn't want to damage lots of infrastructure. His view was, we want to live with Ukrainians when this is over. So we want minimal damage. We want early talks and negotiations. It all failed. No longer matters. If there's no final willingness to talk, then I think we will see what I and others thought would happen early on, a massive, uninterrupted, devastating assault throughout the country.
And then, by the way, that's what that Times article says, quoting these U.S. officials saying that they fear that the most dangerous moments are yet to come. And they've noted that Russia has avoided attacking major civilian infrastructure, and they're worried, that, as you are, that will run out. But go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, well, two questions, but the first one is that it seems like people aren't talking about the fact, two things, that Zelensky has said that he will negotiate, but not with Putin, right? He'll negotiate with a new president, with another president. Let's talk about that first, then I'll ask you another question. But what are your thoughts on that announcement? And it doesn't seem to be getting that much coverage in the United States, at least. The United States.
When was that announcement made, Katie? Because I haven't heard that.
He just said it. He just signed a decree saying that Ukraine will not negotiate with Russia if Putin is in power.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, that's just as good as saying I'm not going to negotiate, because obviously Mr. Putin isn't going anywhere. And the expectation that he would step aside or go somewhere else is absurd. So that's kind of a meaningless gesture. So that's the answer to your first question. I don't know why the man would say that. A very foolish position to take. It makes talks impossible.
And also, what do you think about the possibility of nuclear war?
Non-existent unless we employ a nuclear weapon. There is no evidence of the Russians preparing to use nuclear weapons whatsoever. No nuclear warheads in sight, nothing being moved forward, out of the question. Putin has repeatedly said, even though the West does not bother listening to the man, and that's one of our problems, that nuclear weapons are exclusively for retaliatory purposes. In other words, if we are struck with a nuclear weapon, we will retaliate. So the notion that he has any plans for that is ridiculous. Secondly, if he's ever used more than 20% of his ground force, and we haven't even looked at the Air Force and the rocket forces and everything else he has at his disposal, what makes anyone think that he would feel the need to use a nuclear weapon? I don't think he does. Today, the conventional armaments at his disposal, these warheads on these missiles and rockets, are so devastating and so precise, there's no longer a requirement for a nuclear warhead. Remember that originally nuclear warheads were developed by the Russians and ultimately by us because we wanted to be sure to destroy the enemy, and we did not have precision. So you needed a large blast area to be sure that you would actually hit something that mattered. That's been passé for years, and the Russians have said so in their doctrine. So the age of precision-guided munitions and space-based intelligence and instantaneous communications is with us. So that sort of thing is not needed. Now, what are we going to do? Well, we have people in Washington with loose tongues and, making dumb comments about limited nuclear war. I'm shocked when I hear it. I can't believe it. It's insane. And one of the things that I opposed, but I couldn't do anything about it, was that during the last year of the Trump administration, he signed a defense bill that authorized people to build so-called tactical nuclear weapons. And I know that President Trump was not comfortable with it, but he wasn't prepared to veto the whole bill. That's usually how these kinds of things are packaged. Make it impossible to veto the bill, because if you do, you're going to hurt all sorts of other programs and nobody wants to hurt them. I think it was a mistake. I think he should have. And one thing the Democrats have gotten right, I'm talking about the Democrats on the Hill and the House and the Senate, who've been sadly very silent on this matter, is there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. I mean, the whole thing is just crazy. We'll launch a low-yield nuclear warhead of less than 5 kilotons. Don't worry, the other side will understand. Well, that's absurd. A nuclear detonation goes off in your backyard. You trigger something in eastern Ukraine where there's a Russian concentration with a tactical nuclear weapon. And what do they think in Moscow? Oh, my God, we better launch a first strike or we'll lose our arsenal. And what have you got? Armageddon. It's insane. It needs to stop. And, no one is exercising, in my judgment, proper restraint in this regard. Someone in the White House should say, forget it. It's not on the table, out of the question. We haven't heard that, though. And I know that if Trump were there, that's something he would definitely say.
Why do you think we haven't heard that? Why do you think they're not doing that?
There are people who think that they can bully Russia. I mean, this whole thing began because people were confident for the last 20 years that Russia was weak and Russia could be bullied into whatever we wanted them to do. And once we had established all these globalist ideologues who are in league with the neocons who have been trying to use American military power for 30 years to effectively dominate the world, and you have the globalists who also want to make our financial system a permanent feature of life for everyone on the planet by bullying them with the financial system. You put those things together, and I think their attitude is, well, he needs to understand that we're ready to use it. But anybody who knows anything about the Russians knows that that's a very bad idea. The Russians aren't going to be bullied. It'll have the exact opposite effect.
Doug, what does globalist mean? Is it similar to neoliberal? I mean, we hear the term a lot, but I'm not quite sure what actually is meant by that.
I think that's an excellent question, because globalism started out as something different from what we are referring to right now. People saw globalism, the idea that you would have uninterrupted commerce across borders, the passage of information back and forth across borders would produce a good thing. Over time, we discovered that the World Bank, which is also one of our instruments, was dictating to people in Nicaragua and in Bhutan and parts of India what crops they would grow. We were dictating to people whether or not they would drill for natural gas or oil or coal. And then we set out with this massive green energy business. So the globalism that started out as effectively a potentially good thing rapidly transformed into something bad. And then, of course, we watched our manufacturing base leave the country, and that started in the 80s, by the way, under Reagan, and it just accelerated through the 90s. And we said, well, this is globalism. But that became a very hard pill to swallow for someone in upstate New York that used to manufacture something in a factory in Rochester who now has no job. Again, this was the debate in 2016 when Trump ran for office, because he realized that, and he said, I'm going to repatriate the industries. Had some success, but not enough. There were too many people that were profiting then and still profit now from this disaster. So that's part of it. This war, for which nobody voted. I mean, when's the last time somebody asked the United States, let's have a plebiscite? How many people here think we should, potentially go to war in Eastern Europe against the Russians on behalf of Ukraine? No one's being asked. Same things happen in Europe, and the Germans are saying, wait a minute, we didn't sign up for this. And that's why I think NATO and the EU, for example, these institutions are in very great danger of fragmenting and falling apart. And of course, remember, the globalists said those were the institutions that we were, quote unquote, defending.
So let me ask you about a major infrastructure project that just got sabotaged, and that is Nord Stream, these two pipelines connecting Russian gas to Germany and the rest of Europe. Now, they were already idle because Nord Stream 2 was shut down by Germany under U.S. pressure right before Russia invaded in February. And Nord Stream 1 was shut down by Russia recently in response to Western sanctions. But now the pipeline is sabotaged, at least for a long while, with these explosions. Both Russia and the U.S. have accused the other of responsibility. What we do know is that the U.S. has been trying to kill Nord Stream for a very long time. Why has this been such a top priority for the U.S. to shut down this pipeline?
Do you have any easy questions you want to ask first before we go?
What's your favorite color? What's your favorite meal? What's your favorite snack?
My favorite color is red. Anyhow.
Me too.
what should we do? We need to step back and understand larger strategic interests, at least interests that may or may not be real for the American people, but are being driven in Washington by interests. The largest, most powerful scientific industrial state in terms of output, production, growth, all of those matters by any measure in Europe and in much of the world, frankly, certainly it's in the top 3 or 4, is Germany. Historically, there has been peace in Europe and cooperation whenever Moscow and Berlin have cooperated. And that goes back over 300 years. And I think the Anglo-Saxon powers, Great Britain, primarily the British Empire, and then the United States, and now both Washington and London, have decided that whatever happens in the future, that level of cooperation and collaboration should never happen again. And so there is this underlying notion, not just that the Germans were benefiting from cheap natural gas in their manufacturing and industrial facilities, because they were. Right now, the German chemical industry, which is the leader in the world, optics, leader in the world, some of your more advanced medicines, leaders in the world. We haven't even gotten into steel and other areas of technology and engineering that the Germans lead in. All of those things are shutting down. Tens of thousands of Germans are out of work. So in addition to being unable to heat your home, you're no longer able to make a living, and the economy itself is being destroyed. Now, when this became clear to even someone as disappointing and unimaginative as Olaf Scholz, the accountant who became prime minister, he decided that it was time for secret talks with Moscow to find a way out of this, because he recognized that Germany was in serious, serious trouble economically and, most important, socially. Go back to what I was discussing earlier. You know, all the problems in a society that are suppressed and held in check by various forces suddenly come to the surface when the state turns out to be feckless and incapable. That's happening in Germany. So they're talking about social unrest on a scale no one has seen since 1929, 30, and 31. Unsurprisingly, we found out about these talks. And there is a theory, and I cannot prove it, and I have no facts to support it other than my knowledge of these talks and interests, that we decided to act, whether we did it or the United Kingdom's Royal Navy did it, or the Poles did it with assistance from the Royal Navy or from us. I have no idea. But suddenly we had this detonation and put this pipeline out of business, which essentially foreclosed German options and said, whether you like it or not, Germany, you are a vassal state of the greater American empire. You will do as you are told. You will stand fast and hold the line as we pursue this fight with Russia. Now, here's a piece of news I just received, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I received a tweet from Germany this morning indicating that someone in the German government, I don't know who it was, has said that the Nord Stream pipeline that was damaged can be repaired. And if that's true, I'm sure the Danes, the Germans, Dutch, and others will all be interested in repairing it. The other little piece of information that Americans are not aware of is that very suddenly, within 24 hours of the destruction of Nord Stream 2, you had in Poland a pipeline that had been built between Norway and Poland to carry natural gas suddenly begin to operate and provide, by the way, much more expensive natural gas than the Russians to the Poles. And at the same time, the Poles, out of the blue, decided that they want trillions of dollars of reparations from the Germans. And this is decades after these issues were settled by Germany in the 1960s and 70s with all of the states that were injured by the German military during World War II. So it's very odd to see this strange convergence of various activities right in the aftermath of this Nord Stream 2 destruction. In any case, it's a disaster for Germany. It's a disaster for Central Europe. And this disaster is having an impact elsewhere. Things are very bad in the United Kingdom. And the Norwegians have already told the British that if they're short energy this winter, that Norway may not be able to help them because Norway has its own needs, as well as it's paying customers elsewhere. What we're finding is that all of the European states that have lived together in relative peace and harmony for 50, 60, 70 years, they're not so harmonious. And they are out for themselves. And no one gives a damn if something is what they desperately need and someone else has it. So that's why I say I think this entire superstructure of the EU and NATO is likely to first fragment, splinter, and then either fall apart officially or just sit a collection of empty buildings in Belgium somewhere.
Well, what you're saying is very plausible, because if Russia and Germany are looking for an off-ramp, blowing up the pipeline takes away Russia's most compelling incentive to Germany, which is, resuming the supply of cheap natural gas. But in terms of your claim that there were secret talks between Germany and Russia toward this end, this is something you've heard from your own sources, or this has been reported?
No, I've
somewhere?
read that in open source in German newspapers as well as here. You can find that in the media. It's very difficult, but you can dig it out. And I think it's entirely plausible. I remember both Macron and Scholz were talking off and on to Putin. And I think that's another reason that Putin was not putting his foot on the gas with regard to military power, because he thought, well, perhaps Macron and Scholz are actually going to sober up. They're going to take the lead and we'll put an end to this conflict. Again, he was disappointed.
What is it that the United States and the West wants to achieve? Like we keep hearing talk of weakening Russia, making it so that they can't do something like this again. But I don't think that they're being motivated by humanitarian concerns. I don't think that they care about saving the lives of Ukrainians, or else they would be probably engaging in or encouraging diplomacy and negotiations. Mm-hmm. So what are their actual motives? Why do they care about weakening Russia? Another easy question for you.
Dimitri Simes asked the same question on Monday. And you have to set aside rationality. Because once again, if you look at it from a purely strategic interest standpoint, we have no interest ultimately in who controls Eastern Ukraine. I mean, let's be frank. It doesn't make a great deal of difference to us. What we do have an interest in Eastern Europe, as well as in the rest of Europe, is avoiding a war. And that has been part of American national military strategy since Eisenhower was in office. Whatever happens, we must work hard to avoid a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. And subsequently, after the collapse, even President Bush, said we no longer regard Russia as an enemy, but we have a permanent interest in peace in Europe. Well, of course we do, because at the end of the day, prosperity depends on order and peace. You can't have prosperity without it. And we have always been preeminently interested as a commercial power in prosperity. So logically, none of this makes any sense. So I have to set that aside.
Let me ask you about this news from OPEC, where they just announced that they're going to slash oil production by 2 million barrels per day. The fear now is that this will push up oil prices worldwide. And the Biden White House sees this both as obviously a big threat to their own political prospects in the midterm, but also helping Russia in the proxy war in Ukraine. This is just happening as we're speaking, so you might not have had the time to look at this news, but I'm wondering, just hearing this now, if you have any reaction to it and what this means for the proxy war going forward.
Well, I think it's very important because for a very long time, as we talked about earlier, people were tired of being bullied by the United States, not just with military power, but through the global financial system that we control and dominate. In other words, the dollar-based system of commerce and exchange. People have been looking for an alternative, but this financial system that we've built is both very effective. It's extremely beneficial to us. It's not easy to replace. And this serious effort to now replace it has begun. So you have many countries that are interested in quote unquote de-dollarizing, and that includes the Saudis. I think it's spreading to the Emirates. India certainly is part of that. So is China. Frankly, the Japanese are uncomfortable with it. And one of the things that's happening that nobody ever bothers to point out, which I find very strange, is that the Japanese and the Chinese are currently dumping their U.S. treasuries. That should be taken as a very serious matter, because the assumption is that people will always buy our debt, but that's no longer true. So the Fed has been buying up portions of our debt for a very long time. We're going to get to the point where no one wants to buy our debt. Then you're in trouble, because we can't finance ourselves. And since we have no manufacturing base, we don't build anything anymore or produce anything anymore other than some military equipment. How do we survive it? So I think all of these things are connected, and the Saudis have made it very clear that they are happy to do business with the Russians in rubles, with the Chinese in yuan. And remember, it was the petrodollar that succeeded the gold standard dollar that went out of business under Nixon. If the petrodollar goes under, what have we got left? Now, I'm not saying all of this happens immediately, but I think it's closer than we think. And I think we're going to see more and more alternatives to the current global financial system and its institutions emerge. And I think the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians in particular, the Brazilians, and many others around the world are cooperating right now to achieve that end. And that's something that should concern us. So I think it's a very dangerous set of circumstances emerging. I don't think we're in control anymore, Aaron. I don't think the Bush administration is in control at all.
Yeah.
And I think most Americans are figuring it out. So pretty soon, people are going to say, well, who's in charge? Who's in control? How does this happen?
Well, listen, going back to President Trump for a second, who you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
He is one of the few Western leaders, current and former, who have called for diplomacy with Russia to end this crisis. At the same time, though, I think you can make the case that a lot of his policies when he was in office helped lead to this crisis. He escalated the effort to kill the Nord Stream pipelines by imposing sanctions on the pipeline and trying to, pressure Germany to stop it. He killed some really important arms control treaties, the INF Treaty, which had eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons with the U.S. and Russia. He killed that treaty, also the Open Skies Treaty. And he sent weapons to Ukraine that Obama refused to send back when he was in office, because Obama apparently didn't want to further inflame the proxy war that he started with the 2014 Maidan coup, and also was worried about arming neo-Nazis. But so Trump did all this when he was in office. And I'm wondering, how did Trump go from on the campaign trail calling for cooperation with Russia, a stance that he got bitterly attacked for and really investigated as a Russian asset for with the Russiagate nonsense? How did he go from that to having all these policies that I think have helped bring us this crisis today?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned President Obama, because Obama and Trump in many ways are two sides of the same coin. Now, let me explain that. President Obama, when he ran for office, made a number of statements about foreign policy, about his intentions and how he thought the world should be. And of course, those reflected some of the views he expressed while he was in the Senate. Almost all of the people that were with him during the campaign magically disappeared after the campaign ended and he was elected. Larry Summers was never his economics advisor. You start going down the list of people, all the people that show up to govern do not include any of the people that were key players in his so-called brain trust. Well, you had a similar phenomenon with Trump. Trump shows up and he has a meeting with the Republican National Committee, a day or two after the election in the Golden Tower there in New York City. And they come in, and of course, Donald Trump is delighted. He's won the election. I'm not even sure he thought he was going to win it at the time, and he was happily surprised when he did. And they say, well, congratulations, and we want to help you. We'll be happy to retire your campaign debt. But there are some things that we would like. We would like to staff your personnel office in the White House. And we have a list of people that we would like to incorporate into your administration. And Donald Trump said, well, of course, fine, let's do that. And he ended up exactly as Obama did. And he had people working in his White House, people occupying cabinet posts that were absolutely opposed to him and everything he wanted to do. And when he was challenged by this, he made a fatal mistake. He let them stay. You know, President Eisenhower was asked by JFK right after the inauguration, Mr. President, or I think he said General Eisenhower, do you have any recommendations for me? And Eisenhower said, yes, I do, Mr. President. He said, be a good butcher. And Jack Kennedy sort of stood back, his eyes wide, and he said, what do you mean? He said, the most important thing you will do as president is identify people who lie to you, people who fail to do what you tell them to do, people who are disloyal, and firing them, getting rid of them quickly and effectively. And if you can't do that, Mr. President, then you better find someone who can do it for you. That's your number one job. Well, Jack Kennedy found out the hard way. It was a place called the Bay of Pigs. You'll recall that. And
Yep.
What did he do? He sent the CIA director packing and cleaned that place out. Later on, he had problems with the Joint Chiefs. We know what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were lots of advocates for bombs away. My point to you is Trump didn't do that. And when he finally figured out what was going on and truly grasped it, it was too late. Too much damage had been done. And he had lots of Republicans coming over from the side. We're for you. We're with you. You know, Mitch McConnell, Tom Cotton, Cruz, go down the list. And we want to support you, but this is really important to us. And if you'll go along with us on this, then we'll do this and this for you. Complete nonsense. Never worked. So those presidents are gone. And we are in a terrible mess as a result of things that were acts of omission more than they were acts of commission. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting, the continuity between Obama and Trump that you point out. And there's a story of basically Obama picking his cabinet based on a list that was drawn up by a Citibank executive or something like that. And so it's interesting that there's a parallel there between, two candidates.
Do you know that the person that was advising Donald Trump, he was told to call this man for good advice on whom he should pick? Bob Gates.
Yeah.
Are you kidding? That's the last man in the world I would have asked any advice of. So how do you get that? How do you get Rex Tillerson? How do you get these people?
Yeah.
There you go.
Why was Bob Gates such a poor choice of judgment, you think? He's the former defense secretary.
Yeah, but he just what did Bob Gates do that made any sense? Whether it's the F-35 or let's bomb Syria, let's attack another country, let's go after the following places, let's surge in Iraq, let's surge in Syria. I mean, absurd. When people knew from vast experience, people that were on the scene at times, this isn't going to change anything. It's sort of like the people that have been trying to tell Zelensky, you need to halt these counterattacks. We're losing too many people. We're losing too much equipment. We're not gaining enough to justify these attacks. And he's not listening. He will not listen.
Well, turning to that, back to the situation on the ground in Ukraine, how much of a difference have NATO weapons meant? And not just during this war itself. I mean, the billions of dollars that have been allocated. I think the figure now officially from Congress is at least $66 billion spent by the U.S. officially on the proxy war in Ukraine. But also the previous 8 years of NATO training Ukrainian soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers in Ukraine trained by the U.S. and NATO allies instead of Ukraine. How much of a difference has all of that made to this current war?
I think it has made a profound difference in some areas and not so much difference in others. Let me give you a quick example. This is something which we did not buy and give to the Ukrainians. It's called Starlink. It's a system that was developed by Elon Musk, and it's satellite-based, and it's near instantaneous. You have a dish, satellites keep coming across. You are communicating, planning, coordinating operations on the ground with the use of nonstop satellite-based communications and interaction that allow you to plan and execute operations on the fly. That has helped enormously. And that was provided, as I said, by Elon Musk. The Javelin initially was touted as the wonder weapon. But we know that hundreds of the wonder weapons were actually captured by the Russians. And as soon as the Russians figured out, as frequently happens with a new weapon, what the danger was and how to treat it and how to respond to it, it ceased to be a wonder weapon. In other words, any weapon you implement that's new, there's a very short half-life for that weapon to have an impact, after which the enemy discovers what it is, how to counter it, and moves on. So I think a lot of these weapons have been very good for a short period of time, but they haven't fundamentally changed the strategic equation. And there's only so much that you can train people to do. You know, we've had, 8 years of a steady NATO, primarily US, UK, British, some German, some French, Canadian training. But it starts with a small group, and then you get a larger group, and it continues to grow. By the time the Russians moved in with roughly 150,000 men, of whom 80,000 were combat troops, they faced a force of 600,000 Ukrainians. So the Russians were always outnumbered. But the Ukrainians were also advised to do some things that weren't very smart. One of which was move into these cities and urban areas, immobilize yourself in defense, and fight it out. Well, the problem with that is that your opponent can sit down, light up a camel, take his time, cut you off, cut off your water, cut off your electricity, isolate you, and then grind you down, which is exactly what happened to most of these places. That was not a good strategy. And now that strategy has become fight for every inch of ground, which is another loser historically for any army that tries to do it. Ground is only valuable if it gives you an advantage. It's something you drive over and fly over. It has otherwise no value. So militarily, it has to have a value for you that it gives you an advantage to hold on to it. This is the problem with all these counterattacks. And that's why they're bleeding. So I would say that, yes, there were so many good things. I think in terms of leadership, the Ukrainians have done some very good things. And look, the Ukrainians have always been tough soldiers. This is not a new development. So are the Russians. By the way, the Chechens have been phenomenal in this fight. Absolutely phenomenal, which tracks with the history of Chechens, if you know anything about the Caucasus. The Russians are lucky they're on their side. But the bottom line is that did it change everything? Was it a game changer? No. Because armies are more than just a few years of investment and training. They are institutions. They grow over time. It's like our submarine fleet. The Chinese have tried to field a nuclear submarine fleet. Whenever one of their subs goes to sea, it never goes very far from the coast, and they're afraid they're going to lose it. Well, no surprise. Look how long it took us to build, field, develop, train, educate people to operate nuclear submarines. Decades. So I think you have to scale back your expectations of what military assistance can do. And I think it did many good things, but it was never going to be enough. Is that reasonable?
Absolutely.
Okay. You need to tell me if you want more.
So I want to ask you your thoughts on a tweet that was recently tweeted out by, of all people, Elon Musk. Ukraine-Russia peace. Redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that is will of the people. Crimea formerly part of Russia, as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake. Water supply to Crimea assured. Ukraine remains neutral. And of course, he's been very attacked over this. But what are your thoughts on that plan?
Well, I think it's a reasonable plan, but we're not dealing with reasonable people. And the Ukrainians weren't willing to do any of that long before the war began. Remember, the two so-called breakaway autonomous republics, the people there are Russians, just as the people in Kherson are Russians. But Putin and the Russian government never demanded that those people join Russia. The Minsk Accords was his attempt to avoid a war. And remember, those were signed by Macron and Scholz and others, and they promised to implement them. They were never implemented. And what he wanted them to do was treat the Russians living on Ukrainian soil as equals. Allow them to be equal to other citizens, equal before the law. Allow them to speak their language, educate their children in Russian, open and maintain their churches. That's what he wanted. And that was unacceptable to Zelensky and the crew that was installed in 2014. I don't think Zelensky ever was. I'm still not entirely sure how Kolomoisky and George Soros and Victoria Nuland discovered him and put him in power. That's another story. But I think the radical nationalists and those people are the people you referred to earlier as neo-Nazis. That's accurate. They were the ones that said, if you don't want to be a Ukrainian, you can leave. Your only alternative is to quote unquote Ukrainianize, whereas give up your identity, your culture, your language, your schools, your church, and become one of us. And of course, in that part of the world, those things don't happen. I mean, this is the problem with denationalization. Race, religion, language, and culture are part of what makes us human beings. We are not just economic animals. We're not all Pavlovian dogs. Feed us and we're happy. There's more to us than that. And he was demanding that all of that be flushed and you become members of the new Ukrainian state. The second part is that almost as soon as he took over, the Ukrainian forces began attacking the autonomous republics, shelling these places, killing people, large numbers of civilians that had nothing to do with anything. And no one did anything about it, even though Putin kept saying they must implement the accords. And Ukrainians kept saying, you have to send us the taxes that you collect from the people in those republics. Well, the Russians said, well, then if we pay you taxes, which we're not collecting, by the way, because these people are at war under shellfire, but then we're paying you, who's going to pay for their homes, their schooling, their medical care, their sewage, roads, bridges? And of course, the answer was, that's not our problem. So there was never a willingness on the Ukrainian side to implement these accords. And Putin made that very clear. He told us that, and we didn't care because apparently we wanted the confrontation. When I say we, the people in power in Washington, and the same people today who went in and told Donald Trump, you have to give us this, you have to support us with this. If you want us to do X, Y, and Z in support of your agenda, you have to help us in Ukraine. And he finally buckled under pressure and went along with it. Those people are still out there right now arguing for a fight to the death, to the last Ukrainian to defeat Russia. They're there. They haven't gone anywhere. And that's why we don't talk about Republicans and Democrats much anymore. We talk about the uniparty. Who are we kidding? I grew up with Democrats. I'm from Philadelphia. Democrats I grew up with were great people, great Americans. They would never sign on for any of this. I don't know what they're talking about. So I don't think it's Democrats or Republicans anymore. I think it is this uniparty that is enriching itself on a scale that I don't think we've ever seen in American history. I mean, how did Liz Cheney go from being worth $7 billion to being worth over $40 million in the space of 2 terms, or what is it, 3 terms, 6 years? It's insane. I mean, how is that possible? Well, we know how it's possible. The system doesn't work. It's corrupt.
Doug, after this proxy war is over, we can debate just how involved George Soros has been in all of this. Although, I will concede that he has spent a lot of money on efforts to bring Ukraine into the pro-Western camp. I just don't know how involved he was in bringing Zelensky to power. But we can leave that aside. But I do want to ask you, you mentioned how there are just forces inside Ukraine who just don't see the Russian-speaking population as equal. And, a major force that represents this is, of course, the Azov Battalion, which for years, it's been openly acknowledged. You can read about it in the New York Times, that they're openly neo-Nazi. Congress in 2018 banned any U.S. assistance to Azov. But all of a sudden, since the February invasion, it's like all that recent history is forgotten. And now in the New York Times, you'll see headlines like this one, which talks about commanders of Azov who were freed under a prisoner swap having an emotional reunion with their families, and no mention at all anymore in the Times of what they used to report, that Azov is neo-Nazi. And I'm just wondering your response to all that, seeing just the contrast before the invasion and afterward, how the U.S. has treated a neo-Nazi paramilitary group that it once banned assistance to.
Well, Kolomoisky, who is the billionaire oligarch who's most responsible for our friend Zelensky's emergence from obscurity, is Jewish. He is the number one funder of all the neo-Nazi organizations and formations. Makes no sense to me. I can't conceive of that, frankly, but that's the case. I think that at this stage, if the globalists want to win, they'll use anything and anyone to win. That includes neo-Nazis. It includes blowing up pipelines. It includes sanctions. It includes anything that they can find. No stone will be left unturned. And by the way, you mentioned Soros.
Well, you mentioned Soros,
there are people telling me that he's practically the shadow NSA. That may well be the case. He's a violent Putin hater. And of course, just as he is persona non grata in Russia, he's also persona non grata in Israel because he's a well-known Israel hater. So it's a very strange set of circumstances for which there is no easy explanation. But war is like that. You end up with partners you never thought you'd have and enemies that you never thought you'd have. And that's where we are right now. So if you're again, I just set rationality aside because I don't think it has much impact anymore.
Shifting gears a little bit, the New York Times has an article. It says, U.S. aims to turn Taiwan into giant weapons depot. Officials say Taiwan needs to become a quote-unquote porcupine with enough weapons to hold out if the Chinese military blockades and invades it, even if Washington decides to send troops. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the supposition is that Taiwan is an inevitable target for the Chinese, that China will invade Taiwan, that China has always wanted to invade Taiwan. I don't think that those things are true. If you go back to Xi's statements at various party congresses, the idea was that the two states would grow together. In other words, over time, whatever was different about them would be set aside. They would grow together. And they envisioned, as I recollect, unification between Taiwan and China sometime around 2040. That doesn't sound to me like a plan to invade. The second thing is that if you look at the PLA doesn't have the transport to move tens of thousands of soldiers over 100 miles of water to reach Taiwan. We know how difficult it is just across the English Channel, which is considerably narrower. What are we thinking? I mean, crossing 100 miles of water to mount a major invasion is very difficult. Then the third thing is that the Chinese do a land office business with Taiwan. And most of the Taiwan banks have vast quantities of their money on the mainland. I don't see much appetite in Taiwan for war with China. In fact, every time we sail ships through the Straits of Taiwan, the Taiwan military has asked us to, will you please stop doing that? Because every time you do that, we have to contend with some angry PLA statement and an overflight from PLA jets. It doesn't sound to me as though they're particularly worried or afraid at this stage. And then finally, remember this. Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces. All the major invasions of southern China through Shanghai and elsewhere were launched from troops brought from Japan to assemble on Taiwan that then invaded China. China will never tolerate foreign forces in control of Taiwan. The Japanese know that and will never send Japanese forces there, even though they're very friendly with and do a land office business with Taiwan. Both China, South Korea, and Japan are all dependent upon the microchip industry in Taiwan. It's a known fact. To a large extent, so are we. No one wants to interrupt that. No one wants to destroy that manufacturing base. So the question is, what could trigger a war? What would provoke China to take action? And that's very easy to explain. The presence of U.S. forces in strength on Taiwan, because their assumption is if we bring forces, we plan to invade. And if we put missiles there, it's over. Then China will level Taiwan if it has to, thinking that if they do not, they will be the victims of the United States as they were of Imperial Japan. And you have a similar obsession down in the South China Sea. The South China Sea was controlled for hundreds of years by the Royal Navy. they're not very happy to see the United States Navy control it, and they fear a potential blockade. And we're aggressive and hostile towards them. These so-called freedom of navigation operations, we're supposed to turn off all our radars. We're supposed to unload all of our guns. We frequently go blazing through there without doing those things. So, the question is, who's provocative here? And the Chinese have never stopped a commercial vessel, any, because the Chinese are desperately dependent upon the Strait of Malacca. Why would they blockade it? Why would they stop commerce? And doesn't anyone think that the Vietnamese would be very sensitive to all of this? And by the way, Vietnam has actually fortified and occupied more sandbars and turned them into islands than the PLA has from China. And guess what? Taiwan and mainland China both unanimously agree on all of the claims that are made by Beijing on territory and waters in the South China Sea. So for some reason, we're content to let our friends in Taiwan make outrageous claims, but China has to be punished and defeated militarily for making the same ones. Has it not occurred to anyone that this is another regional matter that really doesn't concern us as long as commerce flows? What interest do we have in the South China Sea? Do we want the oil and gas or the mineral wealth? Not particularly. I mean, if they invite our oil companies in there, they'll be happy to drill for them and charge them accordingly. But the point is, our only real interest in the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca is the same: commerce. We just want to be able to use it, get through it. Everybody does. So there's no evidence that China wants to stop that. So I am baffled by all of that. Now, if you want to turn around and start talking about other things we don't like about the Chinese, well, we can spend hours talking about that. But the solution to the things we don't like is not necessarily a war.
Hey, war is not the answer. That's a great place to leave it.
Hot take.
Yeah. Rarely is, but it sure seems popular these days.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Doug Macgregor, we really appreciate you spending your time with us, and thank you for your time and your insight.
Okay, Aaron, thank you. And it was nice to meet you.
You too.
See you again soon. Bye-bye.
That was the best anti-globalist I've heard in a long time.